The second important rule about taxes is that, in general, taxes reduce the quantity produced and consumed in a market. Graphically, we can see that in the typical case that's certainly true. And we have our equilibrium quantity with the tax here, which is distinctly to the left of our original equilibrium quantity without the tax. Again, in most cases where you see well-behaved supply and demand, this is how it's going to be, and we can think about the change in quantity as a result of the tax, just as this distance here. We'll call this change in quantity. But we can also think again about what the exceptions to this particular rule are. To illustrate the exceptions, we can again take a look at our four extreme cases that we see here. The first exception is that of perfectly elastic demand. We can say here we still get normal behavior in terms of change in quantity transacted, because we can see here that the quantity transacted with the tax is lower than the quantity transacted without it. So we can see that when we have perfectly elastic demand, our change in quantity still behaves as usual. On the other hand, when we have perfectly inelastic demand, we notice here that our quantities are the same, because our equilibrium was here before the tax was put in place, and then our equilibrium's here after the tax was put in place. Well, those are at the same quantity. So in this case, when we have perfectly inelastic demand, our quantity actually does not decrease when the tax is put in place. So we don't get normal behavior here. In our third example, when we have perfectly elastic supply, we get back to normal change in quantity behavior. And we can see that the change in quantity is just here like usual. And that doesn't necessarily constitute an exception to the rule. On the other hand, when you have perfectly inelastic supply, you get the same behavior that you did when you have perfectly inelastic demand. Here we can say the original equilibrium without the tax was here, and then the equilibrium when the tax was put in place is down here. Again, you notice that these are at the same quantity. So the quantity transacted before the tax and the quantity transacted with the tax are the same. So again, we get another exception to our rule. And what we notice is that we can refine our rule and say that quantity transacted in a market strictly decreases when a tax is put in place unless we have perfectly inelastic demand or perfectly inelastic supply. We can also think about how elasticities of supply and demand affect the change in quantity that we see when a tax is put in place. I've drawn four examples here, and we can think about how these examples differ. You'll notice here we have very elastic supply and demand. Here we have that same elastic supply but inelastic demand. Here we have the same elastic demand as we had here, but we have inelastic supply. And in this fourth case here, we have both inelastic supply and inelastic demand. So we can ask what happens to change in quantity in each of these cases. In the first case, when we have both elastic supply and demand, you'll notice that when we put a particular tax in place, the reduction in quantity that we get is pretty big. You know, we're going from Q star all the way out here to Q star with the tax. We get a pretty significant change in the quantity transacted once we put this tax in place. If we look instead at the case of elastic supply and inelastic demand, so here we've just made one of the parties more inelastic, what we notice is even though we kept the size of the tax the same, we get a smaller reduction in quantity. So just making one of the parties more inelastic meant that we minimize this change in quantity when we put the tax in place. You'll notice that the same is true when we consider the case of elastic demand and inelastic supply. Here, again, same size of the tax, we can see that compared to the first case here, we're getting a smaller reduction in quantity than we had when both parties were very elastic. Lastly, we can analyze what happens when we have both inelastic supply and inelastic demand. And what you see here is that the reduction in quantity is even smaller than we had in these two cases here. So you can think about it in general, if you have supply and demand with high elasticity, or they're flat, graphically speaking, you're going to get a large reduction in quantity when you put a tax in place. If you make one of the parties more inelastic, that reduction in quantity is going to get smaller. And if you make both of the parties more inelastic, the reduction in quantity is going to get even smaller than that. So in general, you can think about the more inelastic supply and demand is, the smaller of a reduction in quantity you're going to get when you put a tax in place. Another important rule about taxes to keep in mind is that, not surprisingly, larger taxes lead to bigger distortions, both in terms of quantity transacted and in terms of change in price. To illustrate this concept, I've drawn two examples here, one with a smaller tax amount and one with a larger tax amount. And we can compare the two scenarios. We notice first, in terms of change in quantity, we have a smaller change in quantity here and a larger change in quantity here. So we can say that larger taxes lead to larger reductions in quantity transacted in a market. We can also compare the changes in price to the consumer and the producer. And we notice here that the change in price to both the consumer and the producer is larger when the tax is larger. So we can also say that larger taxes lead to greater changes in price both for consumers and producers. The last rule about taxes to keep in mind is one we've discussed several times already, namely that a tax on producers is equivalent to a tax on consumers. It's important to remember that in order to reach this conclusion, we make the assumption that consumers and producers fully internalize taxes in their decision-making processes. In other words, we assume that consumers only pay attention to prices inclusive of taxes, and producers only pay attention to prices net of taxes. In some scenarios, this is a perfectly reasonable assumption. For example, consumers only see prices post-tax when purchasing gasoline, so they most likely make decisions in this case based on those prices that are inclusive of the tax. On the other hand, consumers may be less likely to fully internalize a tax when it's not added on until the point of sale, such as with a sales tax, or when the tax is not obvious or salient to the consumer. For example, consumers likely don't change their behavior as much as they rationally should following a toll increase if they're using E-ZPass type transponders, since they don't actually see the amount of the toll every time they go through a toll booth. If consumers and producers don't fully internalize a tax, then the tax doesn't distort prices and quantities as much as it would otherwise, and an appropriate model would need to take this into account. In practice, consumers and producers are probably not perfectly rational in how they perceive taxes. For example, payroll taxes in the US are placed partly on the consumer and partly on the producer, but there would be no reason to have this logistic complication if it didn't affect the market outcome to some degree.